The triangle defence to the Queen's Gambit begins with the following moves. d4, d5, white sets up the Queen's Gambit with c4, and now black has a couple of routes to reach the desired formation. We just take the move order with e6 here for convenience. Of course, black could have played c6 on move 2, and this is the basic position. We note that black has set up a nice triangle of pawns in the centre. This looks undynamic because actually black's blocked in the bishop on c8. It's often the case in the Queen's Gambit declined that black sometimes struggles to develop his queenside pieces, and it looks as though this is going to be one of those cases. But in fact, black's setup is much more dynamic than it appears at first sight. For instance, white has to continue to ask himself in this opening, is black actually threatening to go pawn takes pawn? I would say in this position he is, and he quite often does. So there's a lot more to this triangle defence than meets the eye. And on this DVD we're going to be encountering some weird, wonderful and very sharp positions. My impression of this defence is that it's quite easy to play and will be an excellent point scorer for the average club player. So firstly and foremostly, I would say white has to deal with black's threat of d takes c4. So what will we be looking at on this DVD? Well, the first variation we're going to look at is the notorious Abraham's defence, or Notabone defence. That is to say, the line where white goes knight f3 and invites black to take on c4. We will be quite happy to do this, and the main line of the Abrahams goes e3 with white threatening to recapture, b5, this is the point of the whole defence, black makes it inconvenient for white to take on c4, a4, white chips away at the pawn chain, bishop b4, developing a piece, pinning the knight on c3, bishop d2, breaking the pin, and now we get the very sharp position which arises after bishop b7, a takes b5, bishop takes c3, necessary in order to be able to recapture on b5, white goes b3 chipping away, and now the whole point of the Abraham's defence, a5, b takes c4, b4. This is basic position number 2 in the Abraham's defence, and well, black is very much banking his play on the establishment of those two passed pawns on the queen side. White is challenged to make something of his central pawn majority. If white gets it wrong, the queenside pawns will mow him down. This is a ferocious and fascinating imbalance, and this position has led to the creation of many interesting games. I think if you really learn this line with black, then you're going to cause your opponents a lot of difficulty. So that's the first variation we'll be looking at. Dropping back to the position after c6, the next line we'll be looking at is the Marshall Gambit with e4. This is a very, very sharp challenge to the triangle defence, and contains again some fascinating play. I'm going to recommend a very interesting line for black here. The main line goes d takes e4, knight takes e4, and now black flicks in the check on b4. This is an important Zwischenzug, and now white has to gambit a pawn if he wants to get any advantage in this position, or play for the advantage with bishop d2. Then black takes on d4, white takes on b4, black takes on e4 check, and again we're getting some fascinating play coming out of both knight e2 and bishop e2. Black is going to emerge from the complications of pawn up perhaps, but white has a very powerful dark square bishop. Of particular note is my recommendation after bishop e2, when I think black should play the interesting little interpolation c5. If your opponents are not ready for this move, then this can cause them a lot of heartache. Going back to c6 for the last time, I'll then go on to looking at the exchange variation with c takes d5. This, I would say, is the least effective of white's choices against the triangle defence, and gives black a pretty comfortable time of it after e takes d5. White reaches an exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit decline, but he can't play his bishop to g5, pinning a black knight on f6. Black actually gains in this position from not having developed the knight on g8. For instance, if white plays bishop f4 here, well, black can immediately play bishop d6, something like that, and simplify the game. Going back to e takes d5, again in the exchange variation, white often develops this knight to e2. White's able to develop bishop on c1 very easily, e3, bishop d3. He puts the knight on e2 and plays for the central pawn advance. It's not so easy for white to get his knight on g1 to a good square in this position. And certainly we will see that after knight f3, again black has a very easy time of it. So those are the lines in question on this DVD, and what they add up to really is a repertoire for black in the Queen's Gambit decline, which I hope you're going to enjoy and play. Now, just to show you how effective the Abraham's variation can be, let's drop back to the position after knight f3, and the first game I'm going to show you is a game from a tournament played in Bern, Switzerland in 1991 between international master Beat Zeuger and Grandmaster Joseph Klinger from Austria, who was always a very sharp player and who was happy to embrace the complications of the Abraham's variation. Well, black takes on c4, as we know, and the first move I'm going to look at is the main line, e3. White's aim initially is modest. He just wants to take that pawn back on c4, and we make life as difficult as possible for him by playing b5. Now white must make a challenge with a4. If white does nothing in this position, black is really just able to complete his development in safety here, and he'll have an extra pawn on the queen side. It must never be forgotten in this line that black's main trump is his queenside pawn majority. So white must challenge that majority quickly, or he's going to end up with a pretty awful game. And a4 is the best way to do this. Similarly, bishop b4 is black's best move as well, and it pins the knight on c3. So white generally unpins. Alright, bishop b7. Black quite often falls behind in development in the Abraham's variation, but he's banking his hopes on the establishment of a strong passed pawn couplet on the queen side. For instance, after a takes b5, and just dropping back, white can scarcely avoid that move. If he doesn't play that move, black can just get his pieces out, knight f6, castles, knight bd7. So white must continue to play sharply, and similarly, black must take on c3 here. This might seem like a lot to remember, but remember that, you know, most of the moves are forced here. White's angling to get his pawn back, black's angling to, when he does have to give the pawn back, get this double pawn couplet on the queen side, double pass pawn with a5 and then b4. This can be a winning trump if white doesn't do something urgently in the centre. So battle is joined now with white retreating his bishop, keeping his bishop on the long diagonal. I mean, I think that's a sensible thing to do. For instance, white might be thinking about playing d5, opening up fire against g7. So black blocks the diagonal with knight f6, bishop d3, the most active square for the bishop by far, knight bd7, and both sides castle. So I think we can safely say this is the main line position. And now really, it's up to white to make something of his central pawn majority. That is his main trump in this position. You know, actually, if white doesn't start pushing those pawns, well, black's just going to push his own pawns on the queen side. It doesn't take an intellectual giant to try to arrange to push those pawns, a4 at the right moment, b3 and a3, and so on. So Beat Zeuger in this game correctly stations his queen on c2 and prepares to play e4. He's very much tempting black to go bishop takes f3 in this position, which looks attractive in the sense that it messes up white's king, but only white can benefit from such an exchange. You're giving white the bishop pair and you're opening up the g file. You're making it much easier for white to attack you on the king side, to get at g7. This in fact would be a very bad deal from black's point of view. He hasn't really found any sort of plan to advance his queenside pawns. He's given up his powerful light square bishop and he's made life difficult for his own king. So going back to Queen C2, this is why Klinger played Queen C7. This is the usual station for the black queen in the Abraham's variation, and the main point of it is that when white plays E4, black is going to play E5. This, I think, is a very good move and puts the brakes on white's central ambitions. The point of it really is to tempt white into taking that pawn on E5. Again, this is one of those exchanges which ends up being a very bad deal for the person who exchanges. For instance, if white takes on E5 with the knight, black will be happy to take back with the knight. Pawn takes, and now although white's got his pawn back, it's only temporary. Black can play knight G4, and it's hard for white to retain that pawn on E5. Moreover, when black takes back on E5, the white pawn formation will be shattered, and the bishop on D3 will look absolutely hopeless. It's also worth pointing out that F4 in this position can be answered by knight E3. Going back to E5, well, again, white could think about taking this pawn. A very bad deal once more. Knight G4, and black is regaining material. I suppose this time white could think about throwing in the move E6. Black is happy to take, and what is white's follow-up? Suddenly white finds himself in trouble down the F file. So that's why, going back to E5, white generally either plays D5 or C5 in this position, and this is the move that Zeuger played. Just going back once again, D5 looks attractive. I mean, it does throttle the bishop on B7, but those pawns are very inflexible. For instance, if black simply plays rook E8 in this position, he's getting ready to play the key move here, knight to C5. White finds that he can't advance his central pawns any further if black puts the stopper on C5. Now black has an excellent position, and note the knight on C5 is preparing the move A4. That is definitely a move white does not want to see in this line, the move A4, because he'll have serious difficulty holding up the queenside pawns in that case. So once again, you know, it's a lot of moves. We're 16 moves into the game, but they're all moves which I think are relatively easy to understand. White's just trying to find the best way of getting his pawns going in the centre, and black is trying to find the best way to stop him. So it makes sense here for Klinger to smash up the centre with E takes D4, and that's exactly what he did. White recaptured with the bishop in order to keep his pawn on C5 protected, and black played knight G4. Another key move, not only eyeing H2, but very much thinking about putting a knight on E5 to shore up the centre, and in particular that square on E5. Black's plan here, probably bishop C6 and then A4. Black can get those moves in, again he'll be very, very happy. So white tries to stop him with bishop B5, or at least dissuade him from so doing. White could also have played bishop C4 in this position. Black then puts a knight on E5. Very sharp position continues to occur after knight takes E5, knight takes E5, and then bishop D5. But my impression is that black is okay here. Going back to the game then, Zeuger played bishop B5, and black did indeed put the knight on E5. There was an exchange of knights, and white went queen to B2. Now I must admit, if I was white in this position, I'd be tempted by the move F4. That looks logical. Black would then have to put his knight back on C6, and white would probably have to retain that bishop by going bishop B2. Well, then comes bishop A6. Again, a move which secures good counterplay for black, and a very unclear position is the result. You know, if white doesn't finish black off with a quick attack in this position, then you know only white can be staring defeat in the face here because of those queenside pawns. Moreover, the pawn on C5 is very weak. So white decided to go queen B2, and black played F6. Again, sensible move, shoring up the knight. Very thematic. I chose this game as the first one on this DVD because I think it contains a number of typical ideas which we should take on board. White took, bishop takes E5, and now F takes E5. a dynamic recapture, staying in the middle game, eyeing the pawn on c5 and opening up the f file. It's far less dynamic in this position to take with the queen. You know, this would not be a good deal for black, because I think in this position c6 and then rook fc1 gives white an undoubted advantage. Here we see the usefulness of the bishop on b5, holding up black's pawns, and at the same time white brings his rook to a half open file in behind the passed pawn, threatening further aggression with rook c5. This is a prospectless position for black, so it's no real surprise that Klinger takes back with the pawn. c6, bishop c8. It looks as though black is going backward, but in fact that's a necessary and important move. Bishop a6 in this position has not got the same effect. White can play queen a2 check, and then he can take on a5 with a big advantage. So going back to the game, bishop c8, rook fc1 by white in behind the passed pawn, queen b6, queen takes a5, queen takes e5, excuse me, and now a4. I was thinking of the next move. So Klinger has sacrificed a pawn, and he's getting his own passed pawns rolling. Just dropping back, there was also the possibility here of taking on f2. Another interesting move, king h1. But what is black's follow-up? A lot of players would be tempted to play queen takes f2 check, but in fact in this position white is better. White's threatening rook f1, and the passed pawns on the queen side have not started to roll. So it follows that a definite idea for black is to get those pawns rolling whenever he can. And the point of this move, a4, can be seen in the short variation after bishop takes a4. Then comes rook takes a4, rook takes a4, only now queen takes f2 check, and then mate in two moves after queen f1. Going back to the position after a4 then, black has advanced his majority using tactical means. The other line is queen c5, where white tries to exchange off the queens. Well, here we see the definite usefulness of getting those pawns going, because black can play b3, and again white can't really capture on a4 in this position with the rook, because then we go b2. Mate on the back rank looms. So going back to a4 one more time, we come then to the game, and Zeuger plays rook c5 to block the black queen out of the game as much as anything else. Klinger continues to push, and white tries to get his bishop to a good square after bishop c4 check. Black tucks his king away in the corner, and now in comes the white queen to e7. Only now bishop a6. Good timing by Klinger. White takes on a6. Now there was a sharp move here after rook g5. That threatens mate. In that case, black goes queen takes f2 check, king h1, and now counterattacks with queen d4. This is a brilliant all-purpose move, defending against mate, hitting the rook on a1 and the bishop on c4. So white would lose this position, thanks to the fantastic centralised power of the black queen. Going back to the game then, I think you're beginning to understand already the flavour of the complications that come out of this very sharp variation. And after bishop takes a6, Klinger, who always had a very sharp mind, interposed rook fe8. I suppose he was a bit worried about queen takes a6, rook g5. And rightfully so, I think. In the last line black could take on f2. This option is no longer available, and black is being driven passive. This is not a passive line for black. So back to the game, rook fe8. White went queen d6, having no better move. He's got to keep protecting his rook. Queen takes a6, of course rook g5 doesn't have the same impact this time, but white knows that if he doesn't decide this game with direct attack, the queenside pawns are just going to win for black. Well, the next couple of moves are not that surprising. b2, rook b1, and now queen c4. And black has actually won the battle, because he's threatening back rank mate. The queen is centralised. Queen's threatening to take on e4 as well. a3 is also an option. Zeuger decided to resign. So that's an excellent first game because black is touching down in the final position, and that's what we want in the Abraham's variation. A number of very interesting ideas all the way through, and in the end, white succumbed to the pressure. My second game then comes from the Gibraltar Masters, played in January 2010, between a French player called Francois Marchand, who's graded 244, and the Russian Grandmaster, female Grandmaster, Natalia Zhukova. Again, we see the triangle defence from the opening. Knight f3, d takes c4, and now the main line. e3, b5, a4, bishop b4, pinning the knight. White goes bishop d2. This time black plays a5, a takes b5, it's going to reach the main line position. Bishop takes c3, c takes b5, b3, bishop b7, b takes c4, and here we see the main line position once again. Well, knight f6, you'll recall, blocking the diagonal. Bishop d3, black castles, knight bd7, and now queen c2. Last time, Klinger played queen c7. Now, Zhukova shows another move possible for black, is h6. And we're going to see a very interesting deployment of the black forces in this game. h6 is pretty safe. It takes away the g5 square from white's knight, and reduces the power of the white battery of queen and bishop on the long diagonal. White, as usual, is trying to find the best way to mobilise his central pawns. I suppose once again black is going to answer the move e4 with e5, and as last time, it would be unwise of white to actually take this pawn. Let's just see it. Knight takes, pawn takes. Now I suppose this time around black is going knight d7. Not note this time knight g4, because then I think white can go h3. Black hasn't got enough time to take on e5, but knight d7 looks satisfactory. Black's going to put his knight on c5 and push the pawns. For instance, if white goes f4, we have knight c5, and black is just in time. What is white to play in this position? If he protects his bishop or moves the bishop on d3, black goes a4, and then he's very much in, or she is very much in business. Moreover, the pawn on e4 is rather weak. So, problems are being posed to Marchand. He's lower rated than Zhukova, and this is a very sharp position. White understands that if he gets it wrong here, he's going to lose almost immediately, because black's queenside pawns will just roll him away. So he plays c5, a normal move in this type of situation, and white is threatening c6. So Zhukova stops that with bishop c6. And now the next couple of moves by black are very interesting. White goes e4, he thinks he's found a good way of pushing the central pawns. Rook a7, knight comes to d2, and now Zhukova puts her queen on a8. So this is a different deployment to the one we saw last time. Black is playing very sharply. She understands that if white ever gets those central pawns rolling, she could be swept aside. But she doesn't see any way for white to do that. Moreover, the way black set her pieces up, well, she's going to play a4 as quickly as possible. And that's in fact what happens here, as white goes for broke, as he should do in this line with the move f4. Black plays a4. White keeps hammering away at the black pawn chain with f5, and now black goes b3. So again, this is obviously going to be a very thematic game. Has black got enough resources against white's coming attack? Well, white's problem is that the queen finds it difficult to remain in contact with the loose pawn on e4. All of black's forces are directed towards e4. So, for instance, white wouldn't want to play a move like queen b1 in this position. One move black certainly could consider here is a simple a3. When, again, white's being run down the river here. This really is uncomfortable for him. So, Marchand decides to go in with all guns blazing and plays queen c4. Black cold-bloodedly takes on e4 in this position. And then we get a couple of exchanges. The knight's loose on d2. He takes, bishop recaptures, and now Marchand takes the bishop on e4, which he couldn't have been happy doing, but the point of black's play is that after f takes e6, which looks good, Zhukova was going to play bishop d5. This is again an excellent move. I mean, it's a fork, isn't it? It's a three-way fork. We're hitting the queen, we're hitting the pawn on e6. We're also reminding white the pawn on g2 is on free. So white's hand is forced. He's probably got to take on f7. Rook takes f7 and now move like queen b4. Well, then black should and must play knight f6, but it's good enough. Not only is it good, you know, it blocks out the white attack, and that bishop on b2 is now starting to look very unproductive. So play may proceed. Bishop c4, king h8, rook f2, protecting g2, and now we go queen e8 with the advantage in the centre. In this line, black gets much better pieces, and well, white is left staring down the barrel of a very dangerous black attack here. It's not the queenside pawn that now pose the biggest danger to white. It's the direct attack on the white king, which for instance could occur easily after rook takes f6 and then bishop takes c4. This is a winning position for black. So going back to the game, bishop takes e4. Bishop takes e4 by white is a most regrettable move, but it seems to be forced. And now white just goes into a bad endgame by force here, as Zhukova plays the rational queen d5. Rook takes a4, anything to get rid of the passed pawns, but of course white has allowed black to get her pieces onto really optimal squares here. And after queen b4, e takes f5, black stands much better. Not only is black a pawn up in this position, she's got a far more flexible minor piece. As long as, of course, white can't get those central pawns moving, black seems to have a nice blockade, and black's also got the a file to work with. So Marchand comes in, he tries to take off the pawn on b3. Black's having none of it. Rook b8, queen a5, and now f4. A jab at the rook, which again is inconvenient for white. Rook drops back, f3 opening up the king. This makes sense. G takes f3, queen takes f3. So when on top of the extra pawn, you know, black is adding an attack against the king to boot. It's the principle of the second weakness in chess. White could probably defend against one attack from black, but when you throw in the attack as well as the extra pawn, you know, it's hard for white to survive. White has too many obligations. Queen c7, however, is a good try at defending the position. White attacks the black knight. He's thinking about getting his own pawns rolling with c6, but his king is just too open to entertain any real ideas of winning. There's a little bit of toing and froing here, and white parks his king in the corner. On with the show, king h7. And white played c6. Probably white was in time trouble around this point, and he just wanted some clarification. You could try and go to the endgame with queen g3. Black would be happy to take, and then the key move here, knight f6. Blockading on d5, leaving the bishop on b2 very passive. If rook e7 to try and activate, this only helps black. The king comes in, c6, rook c8, rook b7, and the simplest way to maintain the winning position is just to take on c6 and then put the rook on c2. Nothing fancy is needed in this position really. Black's a pawn up, white's king is restrained, black's got a wonderful knight. I mean, the next stage of the plan really is to find the best way to wander black's king up the board and into white's position. So that would probably be winning for black. So therefore c6, queen f3 check. As I say, the king is just too open here. Now another excellent move by Zhukova, rook b5. The rook comes into the game and white is downed. h4 to stop rook g5 check, queen g4 check, rook f5 check. All the pieces are joining the party, and now knight f6 is the winning move in effect. Black's attacking the white king with all three pieces, and knight d5 check is a killer. So white tries to escape, no such luck. Rook f3 check, white resigns. Really there's nothing left for white in this position. You know, king c4, well, what's the simplest move after king c4? How about queen c2? White has no play. So he decided to resign. So it's another excellent and very thematic game here. And I think when we see the first couple of games, we begin to understand why black is employing this defence. If white gets it even marginally wrong, he gets crushed. What then is the favoured way for white to play against this triangle defence? The Abraham's variation in modern master play. Let's turn our attention to that now, and we're going to look at a game between the English Grandmaster Matthew Sadler and Mikhail Krasenkov, which was played in the German Bundesliga in 1999, which will show the most dangerous line which white is adopting today. You'll recall the main line moves, where black plays b5, white goes bishop to d2. An interesting move here actually, if white wants to try something a little bit different, is knight e5. And the main point of that is that white wants to put his queen on f3. This is a tricky move, and black's got to be careful of it. The first point of that move, queen f3, is revealed after bishop b7, a takes b5, and the bishop on b7 is unprotected. Moreover, the white queen may, in some cases, slide across to g3 to put pressure on g7. Fortunately for black, going back, he's got a good move here in queen d5. Now if white plays queen g3, black castles. The queen on d5 is very strong, and it's very important that actually black is keeping the move e4 under restraint. That is the ongoing plan from black's perspective. I suppose, left to his own devices, black's going to just try and get rid of that knight on e5 as quickly as possible by playing knight b d7 and so on. So black, I would estimate, is slightly better here, and of course his queenside pawn majority must never be underestimated. Of course that's just an aside, because knight e5 is only played extremely rarely. What we see here is the main line, black playing a5. Bishop b7, well, you can transpose to the main line using this move. a5 is the usual way, and now white forces black's hand by taking on b5. Bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, c takes b5, b3, we've all seen these moves before, b takes c4, b4, bishop b2, knight f6, bishop d3, knight b d7, castles, castles, and now the main line starts with rook e1. We've seen the consequences of queen c2 in the last two games. Didn't seem to work out that well for white, and rook e1 then is a different way of planning to play e4. Well, black knows in this position he's got a winning trump with his queenside pawns, but it's really important that he restrains the central pawns. And Krasenkov plays a very good move here, which you should note and learn: knight e4. Central restraint is the order of the day in this position. Now it's worth noting here that the move queen c7 is probably weaker. White will certainly play e4, black goes e5 to try and put the brakes on the pawns, and now c5 is a good move. And if e takes d4, the rook on e1 is in a very good spot. For instance, black, not a very comfortable position now after rook c1. You can see the advantages in leaving the white queen on d1. This would be a position for black really to avoid. For instance, if he goes rook a c8, we can play c6, and if bishop takes c6, we go e5. The white position's coming to life, and black is very passive. He hasn't been able to get his queenside pawns rolling. So, for instance, knight d5, knight takes d4, knight takes c6, and then the queen is coming out to h5 in this position with deadly effect. So this is the type of thing black has got to be careful of after rook e1. Therefore, Krasenkov's approach is particularly noteworthy. He plays knight e4. Excellent move. Knight d2. Well, the knight on e4 is quite unpleasant for white, so Sadler tries to get rid of it. He's happy to promote exchanges simply to be rid of that problem knight. But now queen c7 is a different story, with no black knight on f6 to hit. It's a much better position for black than before. So, for instance, if white plays e4 again, black plays e5 in some comfort this time. Now it's much more difficult for white to get the pawns rolling. If d5, then the knight comes to c5. If rook e3, as happened in an earlier game, Ehlers versus Stangl in the Bundesliga, then black can break up the white centre and put his knight on e5. Now we come to a position where black is much better, and he smashed up the white centre. He retains his queenside pawn couplet. This is exactly what black would like. Therefore, going back to the game, Sadler decides to play c5. Alright, f5. Interesting move. Restraining the central pawns. Going back, if e5 here, then rook a c1. When you put your queen on c7, you've always got to watch out for such moves. And white certainly is interested in the move c6 here. Obviously black can play bishop c6, but then the bishop on c6 looks primed to be hit by a white pawn. I wouldn't say that was ideal from black's perspective. So Krasenkov continues to try to restrain the pawns with f5, and Sadler plays f3. This small battle is all about white getting his central pawns going. Now white could have played perhaps e4 straight away. That's a possibility. After that there'll be perhaps a couple of exchanges, and black puts his knight on f6, allowing white the possibility to take on e6. Well, this is a legitimate pawn sacrifice. Knight g4 is the result, and black's threatening both rook takes f2 as well as knight takes f2 and queen takes h2 check. The only move to stop queen takes h2 really is rook d6. Then we come in with rook takes f2, and this is a rather interesting position. Not exactly clear what's going on. Sadler rejects that, plays f3. Knight f6, again trying to restrain white, and white puts his bishop on c4. Well, again, white must have been thinking about going e4. It looks as though he's got enough pieces on that square. Black was going to respond to that with f takes e4 and then knight g4. The threat of queen takes h2 is difficult for white, and if g3, rook f2, rook e2, and now rook af8, sees black threatening knight takes h2. So Sadler obviously doesn't like that possibility. Going back to the game, bishop c4 was played, and bishop d5 was the excellent reply. Once again, Krasenkov pins his hopes on central restraint. Bishop takes d5, knight takes d5, e4. Well, perhaps white should have been more patient here, and tried a move like queen c2. I'm sure black should reply to that with queen c6 when he's threatening a4. Again, this is a very difficult position to call. Going back, Sadler decided to play e4. Fair enough. F takes e4, f takes e4, knight f6, and now h3. A rather slow move. Evidently white thinks he can afford to spend a tempo preventing knight g4. Going back, perhaps it was time though for d5. Very sharp move. If queen takes c5 check, white goes bishop d4. This time round it's white who's sacrificing a pawn to maintain momentum. Interesting choice. Probably black was going to answer d5 though with knight g4. And yeah, again, this is not so easy for white to meet, because queen takes c5 check is now a valid threat, as well as queen takes h2, and black is blockading with knight e5 or e5. So I think that's probably why white plays h3 to prepare d5. Queen c6, white is stopped from playing d5 for the time being. Queen d3. Okay, well this was a position where white simply has to try d5. You know, just take his chances after queen takes c5 check, bishop d4, queen e7. Something like that. Whatever the merits of the game continuation, I think white has to try this line. Yes, black has an extra pawn, Yes, he still has the possibility of going a4, but well, white can try and move like d6. It's very unclear. Obviously black can't take that because of e5, so if he can't take it, white's activated his bishop, he's got a strong pawn. It's not at all easy for black to actually realise his advantage in this position. But, well, Sadler played queen d3, a4, there we are. Once black gets that move in, he's really in business. d5, e takes d5, bishop takes f6, forced continuation coming up. Queen takes d5, check. Clearly, if white takes back with the pawn in this position, then queen f2 check, king h1, then go queen takes c5. Black is certainly winning this position. So white decides to keep the queens on. Queen f7, c6, and here come the pawns. The spectre of defeat looms for white. c7, no grandmaster likes the idea of those pawns coming down on him, but there's nothing that Sadler can do in this position. b2, nice move, sacrificing the rook here in order to get the pawns rolling. Rook takes a8, this was very nice play by Krasenkov. Queen f8, rook takes, king takes, and now the next move is the ultimate triumph of the passed pawns. I remember that Matthew Sadler, who's since retired from professional play, was always prone to get into time trouble. I'm sure just playing on in this position was a result of time trouble. And so the players flash out a few more moves. Of course, white can't stop black from playing a2 at his leisure. He plays it now. And a1 queen concludes a well played and thematic game. So rook e1 is the main line. I very much doubt whether your opponents at club level are going to know this line in such depth, but even if they do, you can use Krasenkov's model of restraint in the centre as the way to play for black. Another very interesting game. In general, I would say black's position is surviving, perhaps with interest, in the main line we've just been examining. So can white do better? Well, certainly he can play a lot more sharply, and we're about to see one of the sharpest lines of all. For the time being, we revisit the main line, and after bishop d2, of course, black plays either bishop b7 or a5. They transpose after a takes b5, bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, c takes b5, and now, in order to avoid just being a pawn down for nothing, white must chip away at the black pawns with b3, bishop b7, and now comes the parting of the ways, when we're going to look at the move d5. Alright, this is definitely a move which has to be examined very closely, because white immediately opens fire at the vulnerable pawn on g7. If you like, one of white's main trumps in this position is his unopposed dark square bishop on c3. So white simply intends to use it. There is more than a dash of poison in this variation. Well, fortunately for black, for the time being, it's very straightforward. He's just got to block the diagonal. So knight f6 is normal, and now white takes on c4. He makes this capture under what he thinks are improved circumstances. But black forces the pace with b4, and now in view of black's threat just to take on d5, white's got to continue with forcing moves. Bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, and now if white didn't have a good move here, obviously black would just castle and be in much better shape than he is in the other line. So the only move really to justify white's play is queen a4 check, and indeed this is a very disruptive move. Black really can't just trot out automatic moves against this particular variation. He has to know exactly what to do. Now, in some games, black has played the incredibly risky move king e7. I think we should stick with normal moves if we can, and knight d7 is the way to go. White generally plays knight d4, bringing his knight into the action, and white's hampering black because black can't really castle in this position due to the hanging knight on d7. So, nevertheless, e5, nudging the white knight away from its dominating central position. Knight drops back, and now really white's threat of knight c5 is so strong that king e7 now has to be played. So you might find this a little bit unattractive, but let's review the situation. Black is ahead in development. Yes, white does have some attacking prospect, of course, due to the fact that the black king is stuck in the middle. But, well, black can defend himself in this position. What white would love to do, of course, is to get his central pawns rolling. If he could just find time for c5 and then d6, the black king would really start to feel the heat. So black's task over the next couple of moves is really just to consolidate this position and make sure that white can't play that idea. Which brings us to the game Srebrenik versus Maximenko, played in Vrnjačka Banja 1991, where white played queen to b5. So that move is disruptive. It hits the black bishop on b7, and it makes a first step towards getting the pawns rolling. Note that white is also attacking that pawn on a5 now. Well, just going back one move, there are other tries for white here, one of which is bishop e2. Now black should play rook hc8, a good blockading move, holding up the pawns, and it's really not that easy for white to prosecute his attack in this position. For instance, if bishop g4, which was played in the game Neumann versus Stangl Bundesliga 1996, black played queen to d6, and now white went in for this very risky move, knight takes a5. Rook c5 was the reply, and after knight takes b7, rook takes a4, rook takes a4. This was white's idea, a queen sacrifice. Black played queen to g6, and this is a very good move because black's not only hitting the bishop on g4, he's also threatening a move like queen b1 check, which is very dangerous. After castles, queen takes g4, knight takes c5, knight takes c5, rook takes b4. Black was better after queen e2, h3, and now g6. Black's pieces are coordinating perfectly here, and he has held up the white pawns. Let's go now back to the position after king e7 then, and take another look at bishop e2, rook hc8, and this time we'll give white the move rook d1. Well, obviously white is trying to get those pawns rolling. Knight c5 is a good move, knight takes c5, rook takes c5, and now castles. This is a more dangerous test of black's resources. This was played in the game Gelfand versus Weisse, Kapdagda 1996. White's plan, an all-out attack against the black king, whilst trying to keep the pawns at bay. This is absolutely typical play in this particular position. Well, Weisse played king f8, f4 by Gelfand, and black played rook d8. This is a very sharp position, very unclear. In Weisse versus Gelfand, white played queen a1, rook e8 was the move, queen b1, and black played king g8. Artificial castling is taken some time. After bishop d3, h6 was played, f takes e5, queen takes e5, rook f3, and black played bishop a6. Queen a2 has happened, queen c3, with the initiative for black. Finally, black has consolidated, attacks white's c-pawn, and is getting ready for b3. So, I think this fragment represents typical play in this position. Just dropping back once again to the position after rook d8. White could try king h1, as played in the game Nikolaidis versus Mastrovasilis, Athens 1998. King g8 was again played, and white played bishop d3, with similar complications. I imagine black plays h6 in this position. Well, we go back to our mainline game now, Srebrenik versus Maximenko, and we rejoin it after queen b5. I think you may already be getting a flavour for the complications that arise in this line. Really unclear play. You have to be ready for almost anything. Bishop a6 by Mastrovasilis. Queen takes a5, and now rook hb8. Black gambits a pawn in order to get coordinated. Now it's white who has to think about defence. As you know, white has some problems here, certain problems with his king stuck in the middle. He tried d6 check, and the black king went to e8 this time, monitoring the knight. It's important that black negotiates the tactical complications here. What white's relying on in certain lines is just to attack the knight on d7 and gain the tempo thereby. By protecting the knight, black saves time. Time is of the essence in this position. If white gets castled in peace, then he's going to be winning. Black must ensure that he doesn't do this. Well, the complications continued after queen d5, and Maximenko played bishop b7. This is an excellent move, just simply attacking the black queen, the white queen. White played queen d2. Black snapped off the rook. Knight takes a1, and now brought his knight to the dream square, knight c5. Now there are ideas of knight e4 in the air. So white continued with once again forcing play, and black put his king on d8. This all looks extremely hair-raising, but how is white going to take advantage of it? He hasn't got any development to do so. Queen takes b4, continuing the pawn grabbing, and black played queen d6. Now there are very severe dangers that the white king is going to be stuck in the middle, and the immediate threat, once again restricting white's movements, is knight d3 check, winning the queen. So that's why white retreated the queen, and black keeps hitting loose white pieces with queen a6. Again, a very awkward move to meet. Queen b2, and the game came to a sudden and remarkable end after queen a5 check. The problem for white is he's losing material. If he moves his king to a light square, let's say he plays, well, king d1, then we have the brilliant move bishop f3 check, winning the queen. If we go back to queen a5 check, if he blocks with queen d2, well then by far the simplest move is just to take off that knight on a1. So in this position the white king perished and never got out of the centre. This game is a good example of what might happen dropping back to the position after bishop b7 after the very complicated move d5. Play through this game more than once to get a feel for the complications. Yes, you will have to play in the main line with your king on e7, but you can take heart from the fact that white isn't very well developed here, and it really isn't that easy for him to get his central pawns rolling. This position has cropped up quite a few times in Grandmaster chess, and the jury is still out. I find it very unlikely that the average club player is going to know this line back to front. You will have an added advantage if you study the notes and my commentary closely. White has another choice in the main line which we're going to examine, and that is to take with the pawn on move 9. Bishop d2, a5, a takes b5, bishop takes c3, and now white recaptures with the pawn. At first sight this looks like a completely senseless recapture. Black takes back on b5, and now white has this overgrown pawn on d2, and he doesn't seem to have any complications at his disposal to justify the pawn sacrifice. However, we note a couple of things about the white position. The white central pawns constitute a dangerous force. If white was to play e4 quickly, then the supposed overgrown pawn on bishop on d2 would be unleashed. The second thing we note is that black is quite weak on the light squares, and especially down the long diagonal. White is hoping to spring a surprise here by perhaps playing knight e5 quickly and then bringing out his queen. For instance, in this position, moves like queen f3 and queen g4 become a dangerous threat. White may also consider moves such as rook b1, which, if there was a black bishop on b7, would set up ideas of taking on c4. So black has to be careful in this line, very careful. And to show you how black should play, in fact this is an ideal example, we go now to the Moscow Olympiad in 1994 and come to a game between Svetlana Matvieva and Grandmaster Zsuzsa Polgar, who was quite a keen exponent of the Abrahams variation. Black should continue with knight f6, and now Matt Vieira played rook b1. It's my impression that black shouldn't be in too much of a hurry to move this bishop on c8 just yet to b7. In fact, in the game, Polgar found a better position for this bishop on a6. Black's initial approach in this line has got to be consolidatory. It's very important for black to get castled. And, well, this is exactly what Polgar does. Matt Vieira played bishop e2. Well, you know, there are moves such as queen f3 in the position. Probably black is going to answer that move simply by playing knight bd7. And if knight takes d7, we go knight takes d7. Everything's covered, we're getting ready for castling. White has failed to justify the pawn sacrifice. So with this possibility in mind, that's why white played bishop e2. Black castled, and white played f4. Again, I suppose white could have considered bishop f3 in this position. Then I'm sure Polgar was going to go rook a7. This is another good reason not to put the bishop on b7 early. The rook has got plenty of scope along the second rank for action. In fact, Polgar uses this option in the game. So f4, hoping to get to grips with black's pawns after f5, and Polgar put her knight in on e4. Perhaps slightly surprisingly, she's getting ready to take off that bishop on d2. This forces simplification, which can only be in black's favour in this position. Black removes a potential attacker and clears the decks for action. Rook a7, now moves like f6 will expel the white knight from e5. So with f6 coming up, white takes action with d5. White's got to continue building momentum here for the attack. Alright, bishop takes d5, king h8, another careful defensive move. Rook d1, and now queen e8. The thing to remember about this position, it looks as though black's moves are more or less entirely defensive, which of course they are. Black is a pawn up. You know, black must be prepared to endure a little bit of inconvenience for this extra pawn, because, well, after all, it is a very important pawn. It's the passed pawn on a5. If the white attack breaks down here, black is simply going to be winning. Matt Vieira played king f2. I mean, it really is doubtful with f6 coming up whether white has enough for the pawn. White's down to speculative moves such as queen d4 and now rook e7. So black is now on the verge of consolidation. White is going backwards. Polgar's queen's getting ready to come out to a square like g6, and maybe knight d7 is also in the wings. So black is winning unless white does something drastic. So Matt Vieira throws caution to the winds and plays knight f7. This is not an especially good way of tackling the position, but she is getting desperate. Queen b6. Now black has got two pieces and a pawn for the rook. Of course, there is a temporary inconvenience with development, but Polgar solves this easily enough by putting her bishop on b7. Now the plan is something like bishop e4 and then bishop d3, just jamming up the white rooks. So white plays rook d4 to head that off, but of course that runs slap bang into knight c6, rook d6, and now the brilliant move, knight e5. I'm sure Matt Vieira overlooked this shot, and well, it's almost winning straight away. The fact is, white can't take this knight. If he takes on e5, he gets mated in nice fashion. F takes e5, king e1. The simple bishop takes g2 will do, embarrassing the rook on h1. Rook g1, queen f2 check. It all runs on oiled wheels. King c2, bishop e4 check. Queen b1 check. And now queen b3 mate. Very nice indeed. But of course, very logical. White hasn't yet used that rook on h1. So Matt Vieira used it. He played rook a1. Then came bishop e4. Once again taking on e5 is not permitted. Rook d8. And now white has the horror of facing that very strong knight on d3. The knight sinks itself in. h6 to free up the back rank. Basically, in this position, black is not worried about white capturing the queenside pawns now. She's got a winning attack. Her king is very safe, and she's threatening queen g4. F5 was played, again very desperate. Bishop takes F5, rook takes A5, bishop E4, covering A8. Queen H5, bishop takes G2. It's a mop-up job now. Rook A7, and now Queen B8. Again, this is a very, very strong move, forcing resignation. Black's on the rook. She's threatening Queen to B2 check. Well, she's threatening to penetrate with the Queen. So Matvieva resigned. Going back to the opening one more time, it's my impression that after bishop takes C3, B takes C3 is not dangerous, as long as you remember the following key points. When you take back on B5, white's threatening pressure on the long diagonal. Don't be in a hurry to develop the bishop to B7. That could be a target for tactical strikes from the white pieces. Instead, A6 is probably the right square, consolidating the extra pawn. You will have to be careful initially, watching out for a kingside attack. But study Polgar's excellent example that we've just seen more than once, and you'll be ready to face this very rare line. Until now, we have been looking at the main line, where white plays E3 after black captures on C4. For instance, in this position. One question I know a lot of you will be asking is, why has white settled for the modest E3 when he can play E4? Well, the answer is that in this particular variation, E4, whilst it looks very dangerous, is not perhaps as aggressive as it looks, because there's no black knight on F6. If there was a black knight on F6, usually that knight could be hassled by the advancing white E-pawn. So it follows that, you know, in order to make something of this position, black has got to emphasise this feature of the position, and he's got to wait until the right moment to develop this knight on G8. Now, it's clear to me that black has to play B5 after E4 in order to keep his pawn. I mean, if he just lets white take the pawn back on C4, then white's going to have a massive centre, good development, and black's have nothing to set against that whatsoever. So it's a question now after B5 of how white tries to seek compensation for the pawn, because it is genuine pawn sacrifice in this variation. I think that's what puts a lot of really strong players off this line. White is a pawn down with absolutely no clear way of getting it back. He's just gambling that his centre and reasonable development is going to give him some compensation. I'm going to show you a couple of games in this line where white plays the two critical moves, the first of which is A4. And this is the game Badur Jobova versus Etienne Bacrot, two very strong grandmasters, and this was played in Linares in 2001. After A4, the recipe for black is the same as it is after E3. He puts his bishop on B4, pinning the knight and stopping white from just winning the pawn back on B5. I should emphasise, black must not be in too much of a hurry to give the material back in this variation, unless he has a very clear route to a good position. So Jobova just settles for bishop D2, a modest move, and only now does black play knight F6. This is starting to look like an improved version of the Botvinnik system of the semi-Slav, where white's bishop on D2 is unimpressive. So Queen B1, protecting the pawn on E4. Now, clearly white can think about advancing this pawn, but then of course if he does so, he allows the black knight into D5. Black can consider both taking on C3 in this position and then playing knight D5, or playing knight D5 straight away. It seems to me that E5 is a premature advance, so that's why Jobova just plays Queen B1. I think Jobova's game plan here is just to maintain his centre and hope that it's going to cramp the black minor pieces. Well, no such luck. Etienne Bacrot plays A6, a nice consolidatory move. Bishop E2. A takes B5 in this position is possible. I think it would be answered by bishop takes C3. And now it's hard to see compensation for white. If he takes with the bishop, we take on B5. If he plays B3, we go bishop B7. In each case, black is in good shape. And if black wants to keep the pawn, he can also consider simply taking on B3 in this position. Bishop takes B5 check, and then blocking with bishop D7, forcing simplification. After a move like, say, bishop takes D7, knight takes D7, if white takes on B3 in this position, then he has to consider carefully the consequences of knight takes E4. So, going back to A6, this is why Jobber retains attention with bishop e2, but black now comfortably completes his development with bishop b7, white castles, bishop e7, stepping out of the way, rook d1, and now knight bd7. It's worth noting that in a lot of similar positions in this line, white sets up a rook on the same file as black's queen. At this moment, black's got to decide what to do. Usually he puts something in the way, which takes the sting out of white's pawn advances in the centre. You see, white's not able to get his pawn back that easily in this position, so he's got to rely on detonating moves such as either d5 or e5, carefully played and prepared to give him a good position. If black is able to defuse these bombs, then he's just going to be a pawn up for nothing. And so it proves in this game, with Jobber sort of struggling to find compensation. He moves his bishop out to g5. That's the usual square in the queen's gambit. Black wastes no opportunity to hit the bishop. Bishop retreats, and only now does Becrow castle. So a very safe move, and black remains a pawn up. Yes, white does have the centre, it's true, and that must be respected. But now we're looking really for black to go on to develop this advantage of the extra pawn, as white has nothing really to bite on as yet. Well, Jobber went bishop g3, and now black played queen b6. Again, this is a standard deployment of the queen in this position, this type of position, especially with the dark square bishop offside. If that bishop was still on the c1 to h6 diagonal, was able perhaps to play to e3 at the right moment, then queen b6 might not be such a happy move. But with the bishop on g3, queen b6 is just a good move, and well, black is certainly looking at moves himself, pawn advances himself, such as b4. He's looking perhaps at c5. c5 is definitely the move he'd like to get in if he could, and again, it's all a question of patient preparation. But queen b6 is just a very good square for the queen. h3. Rook e8. Again, very careful move. And now white plays b3, more or less admitting that his opening has been a failure. He's found nothing to bite on in black's position, and now he's scratching around for compensation. Becrow takes, why not, and plays b4, establishing a strong passed pawn on the queen side. White goes e5, and black goes knight h5. Well, now white is really on the horns of a dilemma. Not actually sure what he should do now. I mean, from my perspective, probably white should try and move like a5, nudging the black queen hopefully out of position. But even then, after queen c7, what is white going to do? When he moves his knight on c3, let's say he moves it to e4, just let's say, I should imagine black will snap off that bishop on g3 very happily. And if white recaptures with the knight, it's now time and place to go through with the free and break c5. Well, black is just, I would say, winning this position. Pawn up. It's a very normal queen's gambit affair. Black would normally play all these freeing moves in the queen's gambit, and he's a pawn up to boot with the two bishops. So this is not very funny for white. Jobber in the game, not the best day for him. He retreats with bishop h2. Becrow takes on c3. White takes on b6 and plays rook b1. That is the point. But now comes a very nice move by Becrow. c2, giving the piece back. And now bishop a3. Black in this game plays very dynamically. He sees that his pawn on c2 is the most important chess piece on the board, and now another excellent move here, rook e b8, ensuring the coronation of the pawn. After bishop takes a6, black took on b7 and played rook b8, and in this position white played knight e1, but after that decided to resign. I think it's pretty clear cut in this position that if white moves his bishop or takes the pawn on c6, rook b1 will win, but knight e1 isn't that great either. White has no answer to black queening the pawn. We go takes, bishop takes c6, let's say. Well, rook b1 is just a very strong move, and with bishop d2 coming up, white is powerless. So that was a very good example from back row of how to handle these positions. Patient consolidation, no fear of white centre really, a standard delayed development of the knight on g8, and after that ideal piece deployment. So this will be a good game to play over a couple of times in order to familiarise yourself with the themes. My next game, very recent, will again demonstrate that black's position cannot be blown away by simple means. We're again featuring the line where white takes the centre with e4 and black protects his pawn with b5. And now in the game Burnev versus Alexander Baburin, Grandmaster, played in the Cork Open in March 2010, white decided to play bishop g5. Again relying on simple development and the acquisition of the centre to see him through. However, this variation is rarely simple, and black's queenside pawns constitute a fearsome force. Baburin put his queen on b6, which is a good square for the queen in this variation, as it supports a later c5. And Burnev played bishop e2. So he's decided basically to get his pieces out and dispense with the move a4 for the time being. Baburin played knight d7, and now white decided to break things open with d5. Now I suppose, just dropping back one move, if black was particularly afraid of a move like d5, then he could consider bishop b7 in this position, just putting the brakes on this idea. But Baburin in the game saw no reason to prevent white from playing d5, so black decided to take this. He takes d5 and now block the position with e5. White castled and black brought his knight out to f6. Once again, a perfectly solid way to play this position would be to possibly even play f6 and then to answer bishop e3 with bishop c5. I could see why black perhaps doesn't do this. He doesn't want perhaps a white knight to come to e4, but it's not that easy to get a white knight there, and black will complete his development by going knight e7 and castles. So this was a definite alternative going back to the game to knight gf6, although one can see the attractions of that move. Simple development, getting closer to castling, settling for being a pawn up. So white must continue with disruptive tactics, and this he does with a4. Black plays b4, a5. Now if white doesn't go a5, probably when white moves his knight, black's going to put his bishop on a6. It was far-sighted of Baburin not to develop the bishop back on move 7. Well, he was preparing for precisely such a circumstance, as we see in the game. So white must continue with forcing play, and he goes a5. Black plays queen b8 to remain in touch with both the pawn on b4 and the pawn on e5. Not that they need protection at this current moment. Seeing nothing better, white went knight b1, and now black brought his bishop out to d6. h3, castles. Alright. So, with castles, black is giving back the pawn. I mean, if we go back, black could have played bishop a6 to try and keep the pawn. It's not that easy. White will probably find a way of taking this pawn off, for instance with knight bd2, and then taking on d5 looks very risky in view of black's pile-up of pieces on the d file. So what Baburin does is settling for a sensible approach, just giving the pawn back with a very solid position and slightly better development. Black moved in with knight e4, and white went bishop e3, whereupon black played knight df6. The two players are duelling in a roughly level position. Black brought his bishop out to f5, white took on e4, bishop takes e4, and now the bishop came to g5 again. I would say the d pawn is of slight concern to white. This is why I slightly prefer black's game here, but of course black's got to deal with the immediate idea bishop takes f6. Therefore knight d7, rook e1, knight c5, bishop e3, attacking the knight and threatening bishop takes c5, so black is obliged to take on f3. Queen takes f3, queen c7, rook ec1, queen e7. Well, over the last few moves, white's been playing pretty well. Perhaps he's got now even perhaps slightly the better of things in this position. But of course, black's position is fully defensible. He's got strong minor pieces. He's got no pawn weaknesses, and he's thinking about f5. So plenty of options on the table. It's not the type of advantage for white which is easy to increase. It's a difficult position. The better player is going to win. And now black sounds the charge with f5. White goes rook e2. And black plays a6. Possibly he's envisaging a situation where he needs the pawn on a6 protected. He wants to move his rook on a8, and he doesn't want the bishop on e3 hitting the pawn on a7. Other than that, I find it difficult to see a reason to play a6 in this position. Was white really going to go bishop b5 to c6? Well, maybe that's what he was afraid of. Queen g5, queen c7, bishop takes c5, and now bishop takes c5. With the exchange on c5, white is basically saying to black, I would like a draw in the opposite colour bishop position. But, well, the initiative is of key importance. This is still a middle game, it's not an end game. Therefore, after queen e5, the pendulum has swung once more, and I now slightly prefer black. He's got the initiative, and now with bishop d6 he starts to work up concrete threats. Rook c6, a bold move. White probably just didn't like the move g3 in this position. I mean, that is a very, very ugly move to play, and one can see the unattractive side to that. Maybe he had to do it though, I don't know. Rook c6 looks jolly risky to allow the black queen in there. King f1 and now bishop f4. Queen e7. One gains the impression these moves are played in time trouble from white's perspective. Rook c7, a last desperate stab. Bishop takes b2, covering everything. d6, and now the consolidating move, bishop f6. Alright, well, not the world's greatest game, but it is a fairly modern game, and it did show a way for black, which was very satisfactory, I think, in dealing with, if we go back to the opening, the unusual move, bishop g5. I think that's the value of this game, and I hope you enjoyed looking at it. To close this section of the DVD, I want to finish with a game you're not going to see anywhere else, and there are good reasons for that, of course. It's a game between two not especially strong players, but it is a good indicator of what might happen at club level when white is confronted with this Abrahams or Notabome or triangle defence, whatever you want to call it. It's a game from the Marianska Lazna Open, played in January 2010, between Bohumil Tejcik and George Darbinyan. Two players who you've probably never heard of. That's because their ratings are around 1900 to 2000, and therefore they're just normal club players. How does white cope with this variation at that level? Well, he starts off with bishop d2, black plays bishop b4, and now comes not a particularly good move, a3. We've seen that the only way really to challenge this variation is for white to get to grips with black's pawn chain immediately with the help of moves such as a4. If white doesn't challenge the pawn chain with moves like a4 and maybe b3, then black is going to end up being a pawn up for nothing. And that's exactly what happens in this game. So this game is of great value really, because it teaches us how to play these positions where the opponent's making less than average moves, and you've got to try and consolidate your extra pawn. Well, for starters, note black's grip on the light squares in the centre. So white moves his knight back to d2, presumably preparing to play e4. Black castles. First stage in the consolidation of the extra pawn must be to complete development. So black's plan, what black is trying to do here, is to get the move c5 in. He'd love to play that move sooner rather than later, but it would be foolhardy to do that without completing development. So probably his plan involves something like bishop b7, knight bd7, rook e8, and only then he's looking to play c5. Black may also play in such a situation the move e5, and in fact a little later on in this game we see this move coming to pass. At all stages in this game, white doesn't really look as though he's going to get his pawn back. So Tejcik plays bishop e2, black plays bishop b7, and the plan runs on oil wheels for the time being, as white just puts his bishop on f3, knight bd7 castles, queen c7. Queen's very useful here in this position, and what I think black is trying to do without the move rook e8. The queen on c7 is ideally placed, protecting the bishop and preparing c5 and or e5, however black wants to play the position. White goes queen c2, and black just now plays a final consolidatory move as a prelude to playing the pawn advance in the centre, a6. So white has failed to find compensation for his pawn. That's what it boils down to in this position. And now it's a question of, and this is a situation I think which is going to actually occur in many of your games using this line. Now it's a question of what to do with this with black. Well, rook fe1, white is playing very slowly in the centre, and black decides to put his rook on d8. As you'll see in this game, black makes very good use of the open d file a little later on. And now white plays b4. White plays as though demoralised in this game. He can't see a way to get the pawn back on the queen side, so he just tries to block things up. Well, with c5 having been denied to a degree, because I don't think black wants to take en passant in this position, that would just give the white pieces a little bit too much scope. Black go back to the game, black plays e5. Very logical, opening up the game. So white takes, elongating his bishop, knight takes bishop e2, and now knight eg4. Black is now starting to play for the advantage. He's opened up the game to his satisfaction, and now he's threatening queen takes h2. White takes. Black recaptures. g3. Capturing was not forced on white, but as I say, I don't think white can see what he's doing or where he's going in this game. Perhaps he just wanted to set up an opposite colour bishop position and hope that he could draw it. No such luck, as the black rooks find ideal squares in this position. h6. Knight c5 after rook a d8. So there were other moves that white could have played, recently, but in the end white could not stop this plan from taking place. Black's doubling on the file, and perhaps he's preparing next to play bishop c8, after which the bishop repositions itself on an excellent diagonal. Rook a d1. White thinks there's nothing going on, but he's in for a rude awakening after black's next excellent move, knight takes e3. This completely rubs white out, as you can see. Rook takes e3, rook takes d1 was the game. Of course black is winning now, but if we just take play back, white couldn't have taken this knight with the pawn, as then black plays queen takes g3 check, and sets up a winning fork on f3 on the next turn, wherever white puts his king. For instance, king f1, queen f3 check, king g1, rook takes d1 wins outright. So I think knight takes e3 was overlooked by white. It's a complete crusher. Black takes on d1 check. He brings his rook back, and the rest of this game is really all about just simple consolidation of the material advantage. Bishop comes back to c8 to cover squares, and after rook e7, queen d6, rook e8 check, rook takes, queen takes e8, and now the saving grace, queen f8, queen takes c6. Okay, well that's obviously not going to be very friendly for white. He's opened up the long diagonal for the bishop. Rook d6, queen e4, queen d8. As long as black is careful, this is a safe exchange up. White threatens checkmate, why not? Brings his bishop to d4. Bishop g4, the death knell for the white king is sounding. Bishop f3 check. Okay, just dropping back. Well, there was no need for white to play queen e4, but clearly black is threatening bishop f3 check anyway, followed by a move like queen c8, after which he's going to infiltrate on the light squares. So white went wrong in the opening. He didn't see a good way to challenge the black pawn chain on the queen side. He didn't see a way to get his pawn back, and he suffered as a result. He got no real play in this game. One of the biggest bugbears black has in the queen's gambit declined is the exchange variation. However, it's very worthwhile knowing that in the triangle defence situation, the exchange variation is completely toothless. There are two reasons for this. Black has not yet committed either of his kingside minor pieces, and this gives him a lot of flexibility as to their deployment. Further, the black bishop on c8 is also able to develop effectively early on in the game. For instance, in our first game, a game from a tournament played in Russia in January 2010 between Shuvatkin and Bukavishin, who's graded 2408, after knight f3, black takes the opportunity to develop the bishop immediately to the active square f5. I think my impression is that white has taken on d5 slightly too early. But of course in the triangle defence scenario, taking on move 4 is the only opportunity he's got to do it effectively, or to do it in what he thinks is an effective manner. White's problem is that he doesn't have bishop g5 in this position, which will be a normal exchange variation move because there's no black knight on f6. As bishop g5, bishop e7 is completely toothless, he's got to find an alternative location for the bishop before he plays e3. Thus bishop f4 is the normal choice. But now Bukovyshin shows why this line of the exchange is so innocuous for White by playing bishop d6, and this move equalises straight away. You might say, well, you know, this leads to a rather boring position, and that to a degree is true, but you know, the exchange variation is a dangerous weapon for White. You should be happy with black that you get such an easy game so early on. No problems are put in black's way in terms of completing his development in this line, and this game is a very good example. As White settles for bishop d3, black chops and castles on the king side, White castles, and now black plays knight bd7, reaching an absolutely bog standard sort of situation for this line. White has absolutely nothing for the opening. The position's very dull and boring. It's a question of, you know, how black treats this position, because, you know, you may find yourself in this situation with black quite often. What do you do from here? Well, first and foremost, I think you should be in absolutely no hurry to agree to a draw in a position like this. You've got to stiffen your resolve and get stuck in. There's no reason why black should agree to a draw just because White wants one. Doesn't matter about the strength of the player, it's all about your attitude to the position. So we've got to cast our eye around the position and see what the positives are for black and see if we can make something of them. Now White, well, his standard plan in this position is to construct a minority attack. So rook a b1 was the move played in this game, and that's very normal. White's going to go b4, b5, and then hope to create a weakness on the queen side. Just dropping back, White could, I suppose, expand in the centre. This would certainly lead to further exchanges. But of course, in this position only black can play for a win. Black's first to develop a rook, and White has an isolated queen's pawn. I mean, this is just a small advantage to black with no tiers. Again, you should be very, very happy with such a position. So just going back, White plays rook a b1, and really he's absolutely limited in what he can do in this position. There are just not that many tools at White's disposal. Now it's a question of whether black decides to play a5 or he leaves the situation as it is. I mean, he could easily just leave it as it is and let White play b4 with a move like rook f e8. Okay, what are the positives? Well, let's go back to the game. First positive, let's take out these arrows. Black has the e4 square. Black is looking to establish a knight on that square early with moves such as rook f e8 and knight e4. The general plan in this position for black, if he can manage it, is to attack the white king. So once the knight on e4 is out of the way, once the knight on f6 is out of the way and has established itself on the e4 square, black must be looking to perhaps expand on the king side. In our coming game, however unlikely this may seem, that's exactly what happens. Well, White played a3, getting on with the job of playing b4, and black played rook f e8. Now comes queen c2. Well, you know, why does White play queen c2? I think suddenly he doesn't like b4. You know, a takes b4, a takes b4, and then who knows, a move like rook a3. Maybe that's what White didn't like. There's also the possibility for black in this position of putting a knight in on c4. White bears that square when he plays in this manner. Knight e4, it must be noted, is also a good move for black here. So White is hesitant. He plays queen c2, and black just takes a small time out to free up his king. Rook f c1, rook a c8. Perhaps there was no need for that move, but well, black is thinking about defending himself on the queen side. White plays knight a4, and now knight e4. We said that that's what black wanted to do. Bukovyshin finds the right moment to do it. And White plays knight c5. A rather meek move, but at this stage I think White's just surrendered any attempts to win this game. The black player was 180 elo points ahead of him. He just wants to trade off some pieces and make a draw. As we said, No earthly reason why black should agree to a draw, and we reach now another typical situation in this line, where with queen f6, black is starting to think about a kingside attack. That is black's plan in this position. Well, white played b3. I really don't understand that move at all. But, of course, black is threatening to transfer his pieces to the king side in this position. He's thinking about getting his rook in next with either rook e6, and once knight d4 comes with then rook e5, swinging the rook across perhaps, and then again the kingside attack is starting to build. White plays b3. I mean, surely he should have got on with b4. That would have been my plan. But anyway, black plays rook e7, h3, and now h5. So h3, another rather hesitant looking move. White thinks he's giving his king a bit of luft, but in fact all he's doing is giving black the opportunity to purchase on the white king, and now with h5 black's going to go g5 and then g4, given half a chance. So this is why white tries to get the queen off with queen b2, and black is not interested with queen g6, but at least white's centralised his queen and he's prevented g5. Rook e6, and now rook ce8. Typical massing of the rooks in this variation. White goes queen a4 on a pawn hunt, rook f6, with the immediate threat of rook takes f3. Knight d4 stepping out of the way, and now queen g5. Black is preventing white from taking on a5 with this move and sets up dangerous threats. Provoking f4. Well, of course, as soon as you see a move like that on the board, you know you're in business, because this is a weakening move which white really doesn't want to make. However, it must be said that queen takes a5 in this position fails miserably to rook takes f2. That is the threat. Rook takes, knight takes, king takes. Now the simple queen takes e3 polishes white off. The rook and the king are forked. So going back to the game, he plays f4. Naturally, black comes into g3, which has the merit of immediately threatening e3. Knight f3, and now another excellent move here. Knight takes c5. This is a clear piece sacrifice, but rook takes e3 is very strong indeed. The threat is rook takes f3 direct, and black also has rook takes f4 coming, as we see in the game when rook f2 was answered by rook takes f4. This was black's intention all along, and is a rather crushing and unusual fork. Players spread out over the entire board, and black not only threatens the white queen, he's renewed the idea of rook takes f3, and that's a threat white can't actually deal with. So a very nice and well seen piece sacrifice, or temporary piece sacrifice. Queen takes a5, rook takes f3, some more simplification. Queen a8 check, a more useless check has never been seen in the history of chess. Rook c1, rook f2. In the end, a rather splendid kingside attack. What we notice is a complete absence of white counterplay. I'm not going to linger too long on this particular exchange variation version of it on this DVD, because I think you get the picture. Black has a lot more flexibility in this line than he normally has. Just to show you another good example of the kingside attack that black can create, though, in a simplified situation. Here's a game from the European Union Championship played in March 2010 between Joachim Winzer and Tamas Banush, who's graded 2517. And again we see white playing bishop f4, and black answers with knight f6, e3, and now bishop d6. Black waited until white developed his bishop on c1 to f4 before playing knight f6, and now he challenges that bishop with bishop to d6, which is a very good move. Bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, and now white plays bishop to d3. Castles, queen c2. And now, yes, what is white doing? Well, white has managed to accomplish two small things with this move order. One, he's to a degree got some flexibility with this knight. Sometimes in this system the knight can come to e2, it most often comes to f3, but at least here white can put his knight on e2. Secondly, could white be thinking about castling on the queen side? I'm not saying that's great in this position, but in the exchange variation they do that from time to time. With black, I don't really think you should be worried about white castling on the queen side in this position, because you've got a ready-made pawn storm to hand with a5, b5, knight a6, etc. And white's attack on the king side looks non-existent for the time being. It's obvious that black is in much better shape to contest an opposite side's castling position than white at the moment. Which makes black's next move all the more interesting. Banush plays bishop g4. Very interesting move, and after h3 he goes bishop h5. Black has obviously decided to try to play perhaps bishop g6 at some point and neutralise the bishop on d3. This is an interesting... I've seen it played a lot in internet blitz. Of course, that's no recommendation at all to play such a manoeuvre, but you do see this quite commonly in internet blitz games, this manoeuvre by black, bishop g4 to h5 in the exchange variation. It's a nice easy way to get the light square bishops off the board, and then the usual themes apply of rook e8, then knight e4, etc. Well, Windsor plays his knight to e2, and now another interesting decision by Banush. He decides to snap off that knight. It's a strange one, that, but it's a question of potential. Black figures that the potential of the knight on e2 is quite considerable in this position. For instance, if the knight came to g3, it could be thinking about hopping into f5. Alternatively, the knight may come to f4. So Banush says, well, that knight is going to potentially be more valuable than my bishop. I mean, all my bishop's doing really is coming round to g6 to exchange itself off. So he takes off the knight, queen takes e2, and now knight bd7. And now white is really at the horns of a dilemma. Which side should he castle? Well, if he was feeling ambitious, he could castle long in this position. As I say, he didn't do that, white, but that probably runs into a black king side, queen side pawn storm. Black would probably play with rook e8 to start off with. White would play a move like g4, and now black plays a move like b5. It's not easy for white, in view of the fact that two minor pieces have been exchanged already, to crash through on the king side. g5 is well met with knight e4, and black is coming with the usual queen side pressure, just perhaps sticking his a pawn all the way up the board. Going back to knight bd7, perhaps white would do well to preface castling queenside with a move like g4. But then again, black plays rook e8. I suppose the same considerations do apply here. So probably at the board, going back to the game now, Windsor was taking a look at those possibilities and thinking to himself, I don't really like this. So he settles for castling on the king side. Black plays rook fe8, white plays rook ab1. But now we reach a very standard type of position, similar to the last game, but not quite the same. There is a degree of asymmetry in the position, in that white's got a bishop this time against the knight. In the last game it was simply two knights each. So this gives the game a little bit more tension than it had before. Although g6 is a good move, it blunts the bishop, prepares to bring the king to g7, and once again black is now starting to think about kingside attack. Knight b6, provoking white to play b4. After that, the c4 square becomes a little bit vulnerable. White's not interested in playing b4 just yet. He decides to simplify matters, and again, in view of the rating discrepancy, Windsor was graded 2-3-6-1. Swapping off, he thinks he's going to guarantee him some sort of draw. No such luck, as black starts to press forward on the king side, gaining space with h5 and then h4. This pawn advance is actually quite a good idea, as the white pawn chain on the king side is cramped to a degree by the black pawn on h4. Black would love to have a dark square bishop in this position, for instance stationed on c7. That would be an ideal here, but he hasn't got that. He's got to work with more limited tools, but the pawn advance to h4 is really a good prelude to a kingside attack by black. White plays rook c3, flexible, and now black plays a5. He can't stop b4 forever, black, but he can hold it up. He can also argue that when white plays b4 and black captures, he's going to get the a file for a rook. Queen f3 was answered by a4, further cramping white. Rook a3 was answered by queen b4. Queen d1, and now black plays b6. So is black thinking about playing c5 in this position. It's a very ambitious plan if he is. It's also an interesting plan. Bishop c2. White's only plan really is to attack the A pawn. That has the merit of forcing b5, and now of course c5 is much more difficult to effect. So White just goes back, confident in the small provocation of b5. Rook e6, another standard deployment, we've seen that before. And now White plays queen e2, and Black again redeploys his knight to e7, carefully protecting c6. Rook c5, cutting off the black queen's retreat. f5, and then rook f8. So both sides are manoeuvring. Again, I slightly prefer Black because of the potential of his position. I like Black's possibility of attacking the white king, and now I guess the next idea for Black is to get his queen back into the game via the retreat queen a5, and then maybe queen c7, after which the attack can proceed. It is very noticeable for me how little counterplay White has, how little White is doing in this position. He's almost as if he's got to sit and watch himself be attacked. Rook bc1 with c6 protected. What is that doing really? f4, it had to come queen g4, and now rook f6. Rook 5 c3. Well, this is starting to get a little bit uncomfortable for White. Yes, the kingside attack is building here, and if White takes on f4 in this position, he leaves himself open to ideas such as rook e1 check, rook takes, queen takes, when White's got to go into a very uncomfortable pin here with bishop f1, given that king h2 is going to be answered by queen takes f2. And if he goes bishop f1 in this position, well, let's see, we have easy moves such as queen d2, and there are many white pawns that are rather vulnerable to the black attack. Queen d7 can be answered comfortably with rook f7, and there are still problems with the white pawns. So, seeing all that coming up and going back to the game now, White decides to retreat to c3, and his idea is that when Black takes twice on e3, White's going to take on h4. White is really struggling to find play. Queen a7, king h1, queen b8. The queen had to reintroduce herself into the game. Bishop b1. It is really noticeable how bad that bishop has been throughout the game. Rook e2, queen f4. The queen comes in. Very nice move. A deflection. The white queen is overloaded. g4. Oh dear. Time trouble mistake. Queen h2 mate. Just dropping back. Well, of course, White doesn't need to play g4, but what does he play? The queen is needed to protect the rook. She cannot fulfill all her functions. If queen takes f4 in this position, then Black has the intermezzo rook takes e1 check, winning material. Just summarising, I think the exchange variation against the triangle defence is toothless. We've seen a couple of games where, in a simplified situation, Black manages to create a kingside attack. You should not fear the exchange variation in this guise. You've got loads of flexibility with your minor pieces, a flexibility you don't have once you've developed your knight to f6. So you should be happy basically with Black if White takes on d5. A dangerous line, and one that puts a lot of players off playing the triangle defence, is the Marshall Gambit with 4e4. This is a particularly violent attempt by White to open up the game immediately and take advantage of the fact that Black hasn't developed any minor pieces. It's a direct attempt to refute Black's opening system. Now, as I say, this is very dangerous. White's play involves a gambit. Black should certainly take on e4 and take any opportunity he has really to destroy the white centre. And after knight takes e4 to play bishop b4 check. This is the only move which really takes White head on in this position and forces White to play bishop d2. Quite often in the Queen's Gambit, before White has developed his minor pieces, the move e4 is thought of as premature. White's idea in this position is that when Black takes on d4, as he should, White gets for the pawn an extremely powerful dark square bishop. So potentially strong is this bishop that Black has to be extremely careful in this position. watching out for strokes such as queen d6 and other such attempts to attack black on the dark squares. The square g7 is a particular source of concern in this position. So black has got to be extremely careful about his dark squares in this variation. White has won many violent games using this gambit. However, I think black can defend the position quite comfortably, and I'm going to suggest an idea which tries to turn the tables on white in the main variation, and perhaps it's a move which a lot of white players won't be expecting. Now, by far the most common move for white here is bishop e2. We'll look at knight e2 a little bit later on. No other move for white makes any sense at all. And after bishop e2, I'm going to recommend the move c5. This is a very interesting idea. You'll note that g2 is attacked in this position. Basically, black is trying to ungum his position by playing c5. It gives white the opportunity to take on c5, but only then is he going to take on g2. This creates unusual and interesting complications. I like the fact that black has dragged the white bishop to c5, which gives him opportunities to attack that bishop with the queen's knight, gaining a valuable development tempo. So all in all, c5 I think is an aggressive way to play this system. It's certainly the most aggressive way with black. It's very interesting, it's not meek, it's combative, and this is the way I think we should play the triangle defence. To illustrate how effective this line can be, my first game comes from the Canadian Championship played in Hamilton, Ontario in 1994 between Francois Leveille, who was graded 2380 at the time, and Alexandre Lesiège, who was graded 2460 at the time. And white decided to play bishop c3. Well, we're going to see the consequences of bishop takes c5 in a moment, but suffice it to say that black has now got to start thinking about playing some move which attends to g7. However, imagine white's surprise when Lesiège played the surprising move knight c6. Now this is a bit of a shock to the system, because white has created this threat of bishop takes g7 and then black completely ignores it. So what is the intention after bishop takes g7? Well, of course it's queen takes g2. It turns out that white's threat to take on g7 wasn't really that dangerous after all, as black now attacks both the bishop and the rook on h1. In view of this crushing fork, white's got to continue taking things, but now he suddenly finds his knight on g1 is attacked. King f1 is probably the best move, and now I think black can get away with queen takes h2. So black is now 2 pawns up. Yes, white has kept his dark squared bishop, but this position is by no means good for white. There's no real attack anymore, and black can, for instance, cast on the queen side here after moves like queen d3, bishop d7, rook d1, castles. White has no compensation to be seen for his 2 pawns. Moreover, his own king, white's king, seems to be under attack. So that, I think you could say, is the tactical point behind knight c6. Bishop takes g7 is no good. What else does white have? Well, he certainly has moves such as queen d6. This is another very dangerous idea which black has to be aware of in this system. However, I think here knight ge7 is a good move, and that's a tactical move. It's a very interesting move. The idea is that if white goes in with bishop takes g7 now, black has knight f5. Black's got to be alert to such tactical opportunities in this line. Certainly, again, the capture on g7 has turned out very badly for white. So probably after knight ge7, white's got to settle for a move like queen takes c5, and now we just castle. Black suddenly streaks ahead in development and has a nice, easy game. Going back to knight c6, a final try for white, over and above what happens in the game, is queen d2. Now I think an effective way for black is to shut down the dark square bishop with his own pawns after e5 and then f6. White's struggling for compensation after castles, knight ge7, bishop d3 and then queen g4. White's main avenue of attack in this system is the dark squares. As you can see, the black pawn chain constitutes a very effective barrier, preventing the white bishop from entering. Therefore, I think we can safely say black is better in this position and retains his extra pawn. So white has got plenty to think about after knight c6, and in the game he came up with knight f3. Now of course black has got to attend to g7, so Le Siege played f6 and white castles. So white is settling for quick development in the hope that he can construct some pressure on the black position by so doing. But black is still a pawn up. Avenues to the dark squares are covered by the pawns on c5 and f6. And although white does have some compensation for the pawn, he's got a bishop pair, there's nothing tangible. Therefore, Le Siege castles. And now white is struggling. You know, black's plan now is a move like e5 and then get his pieces out. Bishop e6 or bishop f5, rook a d8. White's got to do something fast. His opening gambits failed to give him any compensation. Bishop d3 was answered by e5 and knight e4 by b6. So Le Siege just protects his pawns. He's not going to allow any cheapos in this position. Knight d6, bishop e6, safe consolidation. Not, of course, taking this knight. That would be very, very bad indeed. When bishop takes h7 check wins the black queen. But bishop e6 is safe enough. White hits with f4. Rook a d8. What I like about this game is the confident way with which black completes his development. He's not shaken by any of white's tactical ideas. He just completes development and then he comes to attack the knight. And white finds himself in difficulty in this position. He's got pieces on the d file which are primed for tactical strikes. When he moves his knight, the bishop on d3 is pinned. Levier tried queen h5, but now just simply g6. With the easiest of moves, Le Siege has refuted white's attack. And with the queen en prise, and with the knight en prise, and no way to avoid losing a piece, white resigned. Note that knight b5 in this position is answered by queen d7, when again there are two white pieces attacked, the queen and the bishop. So that short game was a very good introduction to the way black plays this line. I'm recommending c5 on move 8, and I think it's a move which will attempt to turn the tables on our aggressive opponent. It's pretty clear that if white wants to try to refute black's idea of c5, then he's got to take that pawn and brave the complications after queen takes g2. So he moves to that line now. Black takes on e4, check, bishop e2, c5, and now really the only move to give black any difficulties, bishop takes c5. White knows that his bishop on c5 is exposed, but on the other hand he does grab that pawn and he maintains threats on the dark squares. Well, in particular, queen d6 seems like a move black has to worry about. Never mind, queen takes g2 is the move. Now comes bishop f3. Well, just going back, it's worthwhile noting that queen d6 in this position is very satisfactorily met by knight d7. You could safely say that was one of the main points of the variation. In fact, the white queen doesn't threaten mate. The knight on d7 covers f8 and e7 is protected. Moreover, black is going to take off that bishop on c5. So, just going back, this is why white plays bishop f3 first, and now queen g5 was the course of the game. Spraggett versus Gentes, played in Canada in the zonal tournament back in 1992. This is the main line, and black's point once again is that queen d6 is answered by knight d7, attacking that loose bishop. If bishop e3, queen a5 check, b4, queen e5. This is a forcing variation well worth noting, as it could easily happen in your games. Black keeps his extra pawn and emerges with a big advantage from the opening. So going back to queen g5, this is why Spraggett plays bishop d6. He's pinning his hopes on the dark square bishop. Black develops with knight c6, and now white goes knight e2. Knight g e7, rook g1, queen f6, and now knight c3. A necessary move covering b2. Gentis plays knight d4, and that puts the pressure on white's position due to the attack on the bishop at f3. Now Sprague comes up with a rather strange move, bishop h1. Later he would come to admit that bishop e4 was a better move, and after knight d f5, bishop a3, when white retains some compensation. Whether he's got enough after, let's say, queen e5 is open to question. Nevertheless, that's how Sprague thought he should have played the position. So as it turns out in the game, bishop h1 is answered by knight f5 and bishop a3 by queen e5 check. We come to the same position anyway, with black having an extra move, and Gentis uses that move to snap off a pawn. That's no insignificant pawn, as it forces white into a small concession with rook h1, and now the queen comes back. White more or less is forced to decide the game with a winning attack now, because of course black has a very strong outside passed pawn on h7, ready to roll. So Sprague is really committed in this position to try and decide the game with a direct attack. Queen e2 was answered by the disruptive move knight d4, and queen e3 by knight ef5. Queen d3 was then met by bishop d7, and both sides castled. I think once this occurs, I think we can say that white has no compensation for his material in this position. However, just going back one move to the position after bishop d7, if white had chucked another pawn on the bonfire with f4, and after queen takes f4 he went bishop takes b7, now rook d8. White can't castle, and it must be said that white's own king is in probably much worse shape than the black king in this position. So Sprague probably had to castle, and now in this position after castles he plays rook he1. Queen f4 check, not losing time, and now bishop c6. I repeat, unless white finds a way through to the black king, black's h-pawn is going to win the day. Queen h3, bishop takes e4 check, rook takes e4. If knight takes e4, then knight f3. There are too many white pieces under fire. So rook takes e4, another pawn down the drain, queen takes f2, rook c1, and then queen f3. Gentis employs a really cold-blooded approach in this game. Queen h2, and now queen g3. Rook h1, knight f3. More cold-bloodedness. The threat of knight d2 is incredibly strong. White brings his queen across to c2. He's getting very desperate. I mean, if he takes on g3 in this position, just knight takes g3. Suddenly the white rooks are fatally forked. So queen c2, knight d2 check. It's getting much easier now. Knight takes e4. Queen takes e4. Queen d3, re-centralising. Queen e5, a final stab at attacking white on the dark squares. Knight d4. Black is not to be intimidated, and the threat of knight c2 is a killer. Sprague resigned. So another good game, and a fine example of how black neutralises white's threats in the opening, managing to evade all the tactical opportunities to white on the dark squares, and in the end Gentis came through with the killing counter-attack. Not an especially inspiring example from white's point of view. In this next game we will again see the surprise effect of the move c5. Again we get the triangle defence. White hits with the Marshall Gambit. Black takes, knight takes, bishop b4 check, bishop d2, queen takes c4, bishop takes b4, queen takes e4 check, bishop e2, and now our recommendation c5. If you think about it, white scarcely has any other move really apart from bishop takes c5 and or bishop c3. So it seems natural for us to stick with bishop takes c5 here, and then we're going queen takes g2. Well, given that queen d6 is being answered very satisfactorily with knight d7, white tries bishop f3, and after queen g5, bishop d6, we get the main line. Now we follow the game Klitan versus Posidaru, played in the Belgrade Trophy in 2008, where black continued with knight e7. After knight e2, there came knight b c6, and after rook g1, queen f6. This really is a very committal variation from white's perspective. Black doesn't appear to have any real weaknesses in this position, apart from perhaps the pawn at g7, and it's hard to see white training his bishop on d6 at that pawn to help the rook on g1. In this game, Klitan played knight c3. Obviously the black queen was attacking the bishop on f3, and black played the thematic move knight d4, once again attacking that bishop. The bishop came to h5 this time, and then came knight ef5. This seems to be a very common move in this line and has the benefit of attacking the bishop on d6. Rook g4 happened. Alright, well, when I first saw this game I thought to myself, well, how about knight e4? Why has white put his knight on c3 in the first place if he's not willing to play such a move? But I think black has the very good reply, queen h4 here. The black knights in the centre may look a little bit unstable, but in fact they are really cramping white's style. By putting the queen on h4, black immediately attacks the knight on e4, and if bishop g4, black has the absolute stunner, knight e3. That just shows you how fantastically placed the black knights really are, and of course the main point of that move is that queen takes d4 is answered by knight c2 check. So already after knight ef5, white's options appear to be limited, and rook g4 was a logical attempt to put pressure on the knights. After knight takes d6, rook took on d4, and the black knight went back to f5. And now white must have a good move. I mean, otherwise he's just simply lost in this position. Black will castle. The only real move to disrupt the natural course of events in this game, if you like, with black being a pawn up for what seems like nothing, is queen a4 check, and that has the merit of forcing the black king to move. So he moves to the least compromised square on f8. Queen b4 check, forced king g8, and then came rook d2. A necessary prelude to what white hopes will be knight e4. But black continues to play forcing moves. He moves his pawn up to g6, asking the bishop to retreat, and then he puts his king on g7. White castles on the queen side, looks good, but black now plays e5. Black now is on the verge of consolidation. He's making room for his queen to move along the third rank, and he's preparing moves such as bishop e6. White plays knight d5, an impressive spot for the knight to be sure, but queen c6 just defends with some comfort. After queen c3, black played f6, and after f4, black played rook e8. F takes e5, rook takes e5, bishop f3, and now another rather surprising move perhaps, but a very good one, knight to e3. And in this position, white decided to resign. Now at first sight this seems like a very strange decision, with black not yet having developed either of his queenside pieces, the rook on a8 or the bishop on c8. But the more you look at this position, the more difficult it becomes for white. The problem is white's got several pieces attacked. His rook is attacked, the pawn on c4 is attacked, and black can eliminate that strong knight on d5 whenever he wishes. Should white take on e3, then black's queen comes down and takes on f3. And this is going to force a liquidation, I think, which will certainly favour black. Rook d7 doesn't appear to be working. I think black can take it. Rook takes d7 check, and after king h6, again white has no useful moves. He'd like to be able to give a check with his knight, a discovered check, but no such luck. So it's surprising, going back to knight e3, you know, what else does white have in this position? It seems as though black just is liquidating the position, and once again we note that a move like rook e1 is answered forcingly by knight takes c4. If rook takes e5, knight takes e5, and again white doesn't appear to have any tactical shot in this position whatsoever. So showing respect for his opponent's superior rating, white decided to resign. I do not know of any clear way for white to put black under pressure in the variation where black plays c5 on move 8. We come to the familiar position once more. White plays bishop e2 and now c5. As I've said, bishop c3 seems to be able to be met by knight c6, an unusual example from Lisiège in our first game. And so bishop takes c5, queen takes g2 would appear to be the recommended procedure. A last little look at bishop f3 in this position, queen g5 and then perhaps queen d4. We've seen bishop d6 on a couple of occasions. This move can be answered, I think, successfully with knight d7 and then queen e5 check, as in the game Weiser versus Ivanov, Uzgorod 1988. So now on to the game, going back to queen takes g2 one more time, Sulava versus Palac, played in the Croatian Championship in 1995, where white decided to play the interesting move queen d2, sacrificing a full rook on h1 in order to play castle on the queen side. Well, clearly knight d7 is the only move now. So what compensation does white have for his rook? Well, any compensation he does have is going to be temporary. Black has to find a way of getting his queen back from the dead. That's absolutely clear to me. And white can't play any old move in this position. For instance, if bishop f3 is played, queen takes h2 and now bishop takes b7, I can just see a lot of players playing in this manner. Black has the excellent move here, queen c7, returning to base and refuting white's attack. Bishop takes a8, queen takes c5, leaves white a piece down. So this would be one trap which white could fall into. Going back to knight d7, there's also knight f3, which was played in the game Sulava versus Palac, and now black played queen to g2. Now comes bishop a3. Well, it should be noted that knight e5 in this position is answered by knight gf6, and then queen d6 is answered by queen g5 check. And if f4, black has the amazing move here, and one which should be learned, knight e4. This move not only keeps black on the board, it consolidates against white attack. This is a very important nuance which black has to learn when he plays this line. So going back, Sulava played bishop a3, and now black played what looks like a casual looking move here, a5, but it keeps the white queen out of b4. White may have been threatening queen b4 in this position. So a5, white played knight e5, black played knight gf6, protecting the knight on d7, and now came bishop h5. So it's absolutely clear that white has a vicious attack for the sacrifice material. Black has to be careful in terms of consolidation. Well, Palac played another excellent move here, rook a6, a cold-blooded move, allowing white to take on f7. Just going back and to show you how difficult the defence is for black, if he plays knight takes h5, knight takes d7, black's only got one move here, and that's f6. Then comes knight b6, queen c6, queen d8 check, king f7, queen takes h8. And if queen takes b6, white can play rook g1, g5, queen f8 check, which was the threat, king g6, queen e8 check, king f5, and now queen takes h5. Again, all played before and leaving black in a bit of a mess. So, let's take a look at rook a6, bishop takes f7 check, king d8. Again, this looks horrendously difficult for black, but he is a rook up, a full rook. He's got everything covered, and well, this position actually seems to be good for black. If you run it through your computer, you'll find that this is the case. White played bishop h5, and now black played another amazing move here, queen takes h2, totally cold-blooded. He could have taken on h5. This allows white to take on d7. This just looks a little bit too cold-blooded for my liking, although it may be playable after king c7, and if knight b6, rook takes b6, bishop d6 check, king d7, bishop c5 check, king e8, queen d8 check, king f7, queen takes h8, and now rook c6. when black wins. That's a line which has to be checked carefully. Going back, queen takes h2. Knight f7 check, played by Slav. King c7, bishop f3, and now the black king crawls away with king b8. So it's taken black a long time to get his king to what seems like a castle position, and at the end of the complications he's left, after queen h4, believe it or not, with an extra pawn only. But having consolidated, the extra pawn is important, and let's see how black sets about the task of actually using it to win the game. Okay, e5 was played. King went to b1, and now black played his knight into e4. Queen went to e3, and black played knight d f6. Now bishop f5 is on the horizon, and black's pieces are really coming to life now, with quite unpleasant circumstances for white. The knight captured on e5, and black played rook e6. It's almost in this game as though both players are running a race. White has been allowed to get way ahead in the race early on in the game, and now black is catching up as the game continues. Queen d4 by white. Queen f4, bishop takes e4, queen takes e4 check. There's a general liquidation, and after f4, black played g5. Black is a little better in this position because he's got the outside pass pawn and more pressure on the white position. And rook e8 shows good command of tactics. Obviously if rook takes e4 here, black has bishop f5. So Slav played knight f7. Bishop f5 anyway, white moved his king, and black played knight g3. The point of that is that if rook d6, we have g takes f4. Meanwhile, after knight g3, black prevents a capture on g5 due to knight e2 check. So white went rook d5, bishop e6 was played, bishop d6 check, king a7, rook takes a5 check, and after king b6, black won this game on time. Now just dropping back to the position after rook d5, of course it was probably better for black to play rook e1 check, but I think we can safely assume that both players were in mutual time trouble in this position. This seems like better timing for black when black retains his big advantage, although the game is rather a random affair with both flags hanging. Summarising, the full story on bishop e2 c5, going back to the opening, has yet to be told. But my impression is that black's play, if white doesn't know exactly what he's doing, will more or less win the game straight away. A lot of white players, grandmasters, have struggled to come to terms with the problems black poses in this variation. It's uncharted territory, and will be so for many of your opponents, and you can look forward to scoring quick points with black if you play in this manner, although there are quite a lot of tactical nuances to be remembered. So do study this game more than once in order to remember the themes running through it. In summary, c5 is a good move. In the Marshall Gambit, by far the most common move for white on move 8 is to block the check with his bishop. I'm talking about the position about where white goes bishop d2, black plays queen takes d4, bishop takes b4, check, queen takes e4. But what about knight e2? This move cannot be discounted, although it's not as dangerous as bishop e2. Although a lot of players are just going to do this because they think it's important to keep the bishop on f1 protecting g2. Such an approach is almost like a change of mind from white's point of view. He starts off very aggressively, then he blocks in his pieces with knight e2. For me, it's a less logical move than the fluid bishop e2, although as we've seen after c5, black can perhaps cause white some difficulty. This time with g2 protected, the move c5 is not as effective, and here I recommend the move knight a6, developing with gain of time. Now black is looking forward to completing his development with moves such as knight e7 and then knight f5. So the mainline move is the extraordinary bishop f8 in this position. And obviously this is a bit of a jolt to the system, especially if you don't know it. However, it's a dangerous move and black must know what to do against it. Clearly, knight e7 is the best move. Bishop takes g7, rook g8, bishop c3. And now we get the basic mainline position after knight f5. We turn then to the game Justin Sarkar versus Agyardip Das, who is graded 2404. Sorry, my pronunciation of that black player's name is perhaps a little bit erroneous, but I assure you if you saw his Christian name you would have difficulties too. It's just a question now of whether white can actually turn his advantage of the bishop, the dark square bishop, to account. Black is now ahead in development. Black's hitting c4. And black is also threatening to complete his development with moves such as e5, bishop e6, and then maybe rook to d8. It's less easy for white to unravel. The basic problem for white in this variation is that, well, the knight on e2 is blocking things up. Yes, white's regained his pawn, and yes, it does have a dangerous dark square bishop, but it's not easy to turn these advantages into account, and black is very active. So black must continue actively. Sarkar, a strong international master, played queen d2. He's obviously afraid of black's initiative. I mean, one idea that I didn't mention was perhaps to put the knight on a6 on c5, and then knight d3 would be an immediate threat. So at least the queen d2 has the merit of threatening to cast on the queen side, but it does allow black to take on c4, which is what Das did. White played knight f4, and in order not to lose time, black played queen e4 check, and I think that's correct. Bishop e2 was answered by knight c7, and the point of that move is to enable black to block the white attack on d5. Knight h5, very thematic, and now knight d5, taking knight f6 away from white for the time being. Well, unless white wants to play it straight away, which is what Sarkar did, and allow black to take off the knight. Bishop takes f6. Okay, black is still under fire on the dark squares. Queen d8 is the threat with mate. It's easy to block that. Queen d5 was the move that Das played. White played queen to c3, bishop d7, and now white played rook d1, queen e4. So it still looks as though white has the upper hand here. He's pressing black on the dark squares. The bishop on d7 seems a rather flimsy defender. But it's not easy for white to play this position. g2 is en prise. The bishop on e2 is pinned. And it's a mutually difficult position, I would say. Now probably white can force a draw here after queen d2, queen d5 by putting the queen back on c3. Although even there, should white play queen c3, queen takes g2 is an interesting option, very sharp. Of course, white could play bishop f3 in this position, and then it gets extremely sharp after, for instance, a move like queen g6. But Sarkar decided to play queen f4, and his obvious idea is to try and penetrate with the queen on c7, as happened in the game after queen takes g2, bishop f3, queen g6, and now white put his queen on c7. So it's obvious this is going to be a very stern test of black's resources. Black plays queen takes f6, allowing queen takes d7 check. This could have happened arising from the variation I mentioned after queen c3, of course. And after king f8, queen takes b7, Das was planning king g7. Rook g1 check, king h8, rook takes g8 check, rook takes g8, and white put his rook in on d7. Now, this all looks very well and good for white, but the problem with it is the white king. White's had the initiative for quite a long time in this game, but now black hits him on the rebound, and this is always the problem in this type of position. With no obvious immediate threats, white falls foul to a quick black attack. Knight h4 is the beginning of the attack, threatening knight takes f3. White goes bishop e2. Black goes queen takes h2. King e1, and then queen f4. Rook takes f7 looks good because it hits the queen and threatens rook takes h7 mate. but black has it all calculated. Rook g1 check, bishop f1, knight f3 check, king e2, and now the final killer move, queen e4 check. On the next turn, black takes on f1, checkmate. So an interesting game, and one where white got caught on the rebound. I don't particularly like knight e2, but it's certainly a move that has to be respected. My next example, I would say, is another classic episode in the knight e2 variation, where black acts in a very cold-blooded and professional manner, virtually taking everything that white puts on offer. His first acquisition is the d-pawn, and after queen takes e4 check, white played knight e2, and black indeed played our recommendation of knight a6. Bishop f8 was answered by knight e7. Bishop takes g7 was answered by rook g8, and this time white played bishop f6. We now follow the game Andrei Karlov, Grandmaster, versus Valery Filipov, Grandmaster, and this game was played in the Russian Cup in 2001. Obviously, putting the bishop on f6 is slightly more threatening, but seeing nothing immediate, Filipov decided to take the pawn on c4. Knight g3 was answered by queen f4, and I think this is a very good move because it highlights that white has not yet anchored his position. What white would like, of course, is that bishop on f6 protected, so it gives him time to build up his attack further by, let's say, introducing the queen into the game. But queen f4 is very good and forces white to make a decision, and Karlov makes that difficult decision by retreating his bishop to c3, whereupon black brings his knight into the game off the edge of the board to c5. Now comes queen c2, and another typical move, bringing all the black pieces into play, especially that bishop on c8, the move e5. White takes on h7, bishop g4. So black has given back the pawn for coordination and a lead in development. Now white has his work cut out here, trying to make use of his trumps of the two bishops and the passed h-pawn. In many ways this reminds me of the French winnower in terms of the balance of forces. Of course, in the winnower, white usually has enfeebled queenside pawns. This time the compensation derives for black from the white king stuck in the middle. So black is not troubled by h3 really, he just develops his bishop back to e6 and he's getting ready for casting on the queen side. Well, white plays knight h5 and now black swaps the queens off. An interesting decision because it involves sacrificing a pawn once again for coordination. Black castles on the queen side. g4, bishop d5, f3, and now knight g5. Well, white might have been relying on the move bishop f6 in this position, but that is answered easily by knight takes f3 check. So before white can do that, he's got to protect the pawn on f3, and now black comes in and munches that pawn with the bishop. This entire struggle, this phase of the game, is all about coordination. White castles, black takes on g2, white recaptures, and now black, unsurprisingly, put his rook in on d2 check. Rook f2, well, there's an exchange of rooks, and now black munches the pawn on h3, king g3, knight g5, and now the rook comes to f1. The material seems to go back and forth in this game. First white was a pawn down, then he regained it, then he was a pawn up, then black regained two pawns. Now black finds himself a pawn up, but with consolidation quite difficult due to the strong dark square bishop. Obviously white can play a move like bishop f6 in this position. Well, then there are various tactical moves for black, perhaps the strongest of which is knight e4 check. So white plays rook f1, black plays knight to d5, knight f6, there are some exchanges, and now knight e4 check anyway. So we're going to get a kind of endgame position here. Probably not a good idea with the white king in such close proximity to the kingside pawns for black to take that bishop on f6. Obviously black can go something like knight takes f6, rook takes f6, and then rook g7, but then king h5 is a good move. King d7, g5, king e7, and now king h6, something like this, demonstrates that black's rook is very passive in this example. Passivity is not what black wants returning to the game, added to which that bishop on f6 isn't enormously impressive given that black's got all his pieces on light squares, so black simply attacks it. White plays pawn up, and now, only now, does black take. Of course, this is a different kettle of fish because suddenly the black rook is very active on the open g file, and black can bring his king up to attack the white pawn. So I think we can safely say that white is under serious pressure here. He's got the twin problem of preventing a move like king e6 and somehow defending against the establishment of a passed pawn on the queen side. You know, any stage black is getting ready to establish a winning passed pawn, an outside passed pawn, with the white king way offside. So I think probably this position is lost for white. Certainly black experienced no difficulty winning it. White has serious problems stopping this passed pawn. King comes to d6, king h5, rook g8, king c5. Well, I think in this position, if we just drop back one move, after rook g8, black was getting ready for rook c8 in behind the passed pawn. So rook f2 trying to stop it, king c5, king h6, rook g6 check, king h7, c3, rook f3, and now king d4. This reaches an easily winning position for black, who is threatening c2. So white resigned. Summarising and going back to the opening, I don't think knight e2 is as dangerous as bishop e2. And this is a judgment borne out by results in high level play. I think black can satisfactorily meet this move with knight a6 and then re-sacrifice the pawn after bishop f8, knight e7. If white doesn't go bishop f8, if he, for instance, prefers a move like bishop d6, then black can simply complete development with knight e7. And white finds that his knight on e2 is gumming up the works. My final game on this DVD is a demonstration of what happens when white changes his mind. In the middle of the complications of the Marshall Gambit, he decides not to actually give up a pawn and instead retreat his knight with knight c3. When I searched this move on the database, I was surprised how often knight c3 had been played, given that, you know, white's approach with the immediate opening of the centre early seems to be very aggressive. Why not continue with this aggressive approach? But I suppose knight c3 does make sense to a degree. White's not falling behind in development. But on the other hand, you know, if black finds the right counter in the centre, you can't help but feel that this knight retreat is a loss of time. Which brings me to the game Yasser Seirawan, white, versus Kirill Georgiev, black, two very strong grandmasters, played in Brussels in 1992, which is a good example of how black should play. And black should meet this knight retreat with simple development. This is exactly how Georgiev plays it. He attacks the centre with c5, then he develops both his knights. This is logical and very efficient. Seirawan played bishop e2. Well, obviously white can consider a move like d takes c5. Of course, that's a very ugly move, and black would meet it with the aggressive queen a5, when white can't keep his pawn and black has all the threats. So Seirawan plays bishop e2. Black plays knight g4, another good move, hunting down the dark square bishop. White plays d5, and already after 10 moves, black has a very comfortable game. Now black played knight e7, and white played e4. So of course in chess you have to respect the centre, but the imbalance in the position suggests that black's two bishops will more than counterbalance white's strong passed pawn. It is important for black, however, to blockade the dark squares in the centre. So Georgiev starts the ball rolling by playing knight g6. White might not be worse in this position, but most strong players would prefer black, as bishop g4 again reinforces the idea that black is looking to dominate the dark squares in this position. After all, white doesn't have a dark square bishop. So that's why after a3 black does not surrender the dark square bishop lamely. He plays bishop a5, and white tries to hunt down the weakness on c5. Rook c8, and now king h1. Well, of course, the immediate refutation of knight takes c5 in this position is rook takes c5, queen takes c5, bishop b6. So that's why white goes king h1, just in case you were wondering. And Georgiev retreats his bishop to c7. He really is trying to make hay of his dark square bishop. Rook a d1. Well, there are certainly other moves, but knight takes c5 is certainly not one of those moves, as after bishop d6, black is winning, with b6 coming next. Going back, if queen takes c5, bishop takes h2, and this will certainly give black a dangerous, scary looking attack after bishop g3. There are not many people who would want to play this position with white, as black goes over to direct attack with ideas of knight f4 and then queen f6 followed by queen h6. So that's why Sairawan plays rook a d1, getting in behind his passed pawn, and black blockades with bishop d6. Knight c3 was answered by a6, preventing any thought of knight b5. And now after h3, Georgiev takes on f3. Rook takes f3, knight h4. I suppose knight e5 was equally effective. Knight h4, rook f2, queen g5. Perhaps that was black's intention. He wants to play ambitiously in this position, perhaps reserving the e5 square for his queen, when black is threatening very nasty threats on h2. Bishop g4 was answered by rook ce8. This certainly is a very sharp position, where white has to be far more careful than black due to the weakness of his king position. This is what gives black a big advantage in this position. Well, at least the position is very difficult to defend for white. In opposite colour bishop middle games, the initiative is of key importance, and that's why Georgiev continues to hammer away at white's formation with moves like h5 and then f5. So dangerous is black's attack now that Sairawan gives up a pawn. I mean, this can't have been a very pleasant decision for him to make, but perhaps e takes f5, rook takes f5 was even worse, because now white's position is under very serious pressure, and it's difficult to see him staving off all the threats. So Sairawan goes e5. Black happily removes that pawn, and now queen d2, trying to buy black off by exchanging queens. Georgiev's having none of it. He plays rook e3, and after rook df1 he goes queen e7, which of course renews the idea of queen e5. Bishop takes h5 was answered by a nuance, g6, driving the bishop back, which renders the white rooks passive, and now in he comes with queen e5. g3 was answered by knight takes f3, and rook takes f3 by the completely conclusive rook takes e2. As this was a rapid game, Sairawan plays on for a couple of moves, queen g5, but black easily repels the threats and goes on to an attack of his own, a winning attack, after queen takes b2. Summarising, going back to bishop b4, a move like knight c3 cannot be dangerous, but it is important for black to find the correct counters. I believe c5, followed by the quick development of both knights into the centre, fits the bill. Which brings us to the end of this Foxy Openings DVD on the triangle system. You should now have a very interesting and aggressive addition to your opening repertoire. Well, that's it for now. This is Andrew Martin for Foxy Openings, signing off.